The autumn wind carried the scent of dust and desperation through the streets of Cedar Ridge, Arizona, in 1885. Samuel Morrison wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he closed his small bakery for the day. The 42-year-old baker had built a modest life in this frontier town, serving fresh bread to the growing community of miners, ranchers, and their families. His wife, Martha, had passed 3 years prior from fever, leaving him to tend both his business and their memories alone. As Samuel stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, securing the heavy padlock on his shop door, a movement in the alley caught his attention. There, crouched behind a pile of discarded wooden crates, was a small figure. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with dark hair matted against his head and clothes that hung like rags on his thin frame. Even in the dim evening light, Samuel could see the sharp angles of hunger carved into the boy's face. The child's eyes met Samuel's for just a moment before darting away, filled with a mixture of fear and desperate longing. Samuel noticed how the boy's gaze had lingered on the bakery window, where the day's remaining loaves sat cooling on wooden shelves. Without thinking, Samuel approached slowly, his hands visible and empty, speaking in the gentle tone he once used with his own children, who had never come to be. The boy scrambled backward, pressing himself against the alley wall. His skin bore the bronze complexion and distinctive features that marked him as Apache, one of the tribal people who had been forced from their ancestral lands and now wandered the territories in search of survival. Most townsfolk viewed the Apache with suspicion and hostility, especially after years of conflict between settlers and various tribes throughout the region. Samuel knelt down several feet away, making himself less threatening. He had learned a few Apache words from an old prospector who had traded with peaceful bands in his younger days. Slowly, carefully, he spoke the Apache word for hungry as a question. The boy's eyes widened in surprise at hearing his native language, but he remained pressed against the wall, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. Understanding that words might not bridge the gap, Samuel slowly reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small piece of cornbread he had saved from his own dinner. He placed it on the ground between them and stepped back, using hand gestures to indicate the boy should take it. The child's eyes fixed on the food with an intensity that spoke of days without a proper meal. For several long moments, neither moved. The sounds of the town settling into evening filled the space between them. Horses nickering in the livery stable, the distant sound of conversation from the saloon, the creak of wood as buildings cooled in the desert night. Finally, hunger overcame caution. The boy darted forward, snatched the cornbread, and retreated to his corner, devouring the small portion in seconds. Samuel watched with a heavy heart, recognizing the desperate efficiency of someone who had known true starvation. He thought of his own comfortable evening meal waiting at home, of the surplus bread that would grow stale if not sold tomorrow, of the fundamental injustice of plenty existing alongside such need. Without a word, he turned and unlocked his bakery door once more. The boy watched with wide, uncertain eyes as Samuel emerged with a full loaf of day-old bread and a small jar of honey. This time, when Samuel placed the food on the ground, the boy approached more quickly, though still with the wariness of a wild creature. As the child ate with desperate gratitude, Samuel noticed the raw sores on his feet, the way his ribs showed through his torn shirt, and the hollow look that spoke of weeks of hardship. Samuel found himself wondering about the boy's family, about the circumstances that had led this child to scavenge alone in the alleys of a hostile town. He knew the Apache had been driven from reservation to reservation, often with insufficient food and supplies. He had heard stories of families separated, of children lost in the chaos of forced relocations. But seeing the reality before him made those distant tales suddenly, painfully real. As the boy finished eating, Samuel tried to communicate through gestures that he should return the next evening. The child seemed to understand, nodding slightly before melting back into the shadows with the silent grace of his people. Samuel stood alone in the alley for a long time afterward, staring at the spot where the boy had been and feeling something fundamental shift inside his chest. That night, Samuel barely slept. He found himself planning how much extra bread he could bake without arousing suspicion from his customers, most of whom would be outraged to learn he was feeding an Apache child. The town's relationship with the local tribes was tense at best, marked by mutual mistrust and occasional violence. Just last month, A rancher had accused Apache raiders of stealing cattle, though no evidence was ever found. Samuel understood the risks he was taking. In a community where Apache were viewed as threats to be driven away or eliminated, showing kindness to one of their children could be seen as betrayal or foolishness. Some of his neighbors might refuse to buy his bread if they knew. Others might take more direct action to express their disapproval. But as he lay in his empty house, listening to the desert wind, Samuel found he could not bring himself to care about those consequences. The next evening, the boy appeared again. This time, lingering closer to the bakery's front entrance. Samuel had prepared a larger portion of food, including some dried meat and a small apple he had purchased from the general store. As he handed over the bundle, he noticed the boy's eyes were clearer, more alert. A single day of adequate nutrition had already begun to restore some vitality to the child's thin frame. Over the following weeks, this routine continued. Each evening, as Samuel closed his shop, the boy would appear from whatever hiding place he had found for the day. Samuel began timing his baking to ensure fresh food was available, and gradually, the child's appearance improved. His ribs became less visible, his movements more energetic, his eyes brighter with returning health. Samuel also began learning more Apache words, piecing together basic communication with the boy. He discovered the child's name was Nahana, which meant, "he who protects." The irony was not lost on Samuel, that this vulnerable child bore a name speaking of protection, when he himself was so desperately in need of safeguarding. Through broken conversation mixing Apache words, Spanish phrases, and English terms, Samuel learned fragments of Nahana's story. The boy's family had been part of a band that had broken away from the San Carlos reservation, seeking better hunting grounds and freedom from the harsh conditions imposed by government agents. During a military pursuit, Nahana had become separated from his parents and grandparents in the chaos of a nighttime escape through rocky terrain. For weeks, the boy had wandered alone, surviving on berries, roots, and occasional small game he could catch with snares his grandfather had taught him to make. He had finally collapsed from exhaustion and hunger just outside Cedar Ridge, recovering enough strength to begin his desperate search for food in the town's refuse piles and back alleys. Samuel found himself deeply moved by the boy's resilience and courage, despite everything Nahana had endured. Despite the hostility he faced from Samuel's own people, the child maintained a quiet dignity that spoke of strong cultural teachings and an unbroken spirit. Samuel began to see past the fear and prejudice that had shaped his community's views of the Apache people, recognizing in this boy the same fundamental humanity that connected all people regardless of their background. As autumn deepened into early winter, Samuel's secret act of kindness continued. He told himself he was simply feeding a hungry child. Nothing more complex than that basic human response to suffering. He had no way of knowing that his small act of compassion was about to set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just his own life, but the fate of every person living in Cedar Ridge. The first hint of approaching change came on a bitter December evening when Nahana failed to appear at their usual meeting place. Samuel waited in the alley long past his normal time, worry growing in his chest like a physical weight. When the boy finally emerged from the shadows, he was not alone. 3 adult Apache warriors accompanied him, their faces painted for war, their weapons clearly visible in the moonlight. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs as the warriors approached. Everything he had heard about Apache raids flashed through his mind, stories of swift attacks and brutal efficiency. He stood perfectly still, hands empty and visible, as the 3 men studied him with expressions he could not read. Nahana spoke quickly in Apache, gesturing towards Samuel and then toward the bakery, his young voice earnest and urgent. The tallest of the warriors, a man with graying hair and scars that spoke of many battles, stepped forward. In careful, accented English, he spoke words that would echo in Samuel's memory for the rest of his life. "You have fed our son when your people would let him starve. Tonight, we return the gift of life you have given." The warrior paused, his dark eyes meeting Samuel's directly. "Before the sun rises, soldiers will come to kill everyone in this town. We have seen them gathering in the canyon. They plan to blame Apache for the attack, to justify taking more of our land. But you have shown kindness to one of ours. So we warn you now. Gather your people. Hide them. The death that comes with dawn was not made by our hands, but it comes nonetheless. Samuel stared at the warrior, struggling to comprehend the enormity of what he was being told. His simple act of feeding a hungry child had somehow placed him at the center of a conspiracy that threatened every life in Cedar Ridge. As the implications sank in, he realized that his daily bread had purchased not just one child's survival, but had created a debt of honor that might now save an entire community from destruction. Samuel's mind raced as he processed the warrior's warning. The gravity of the situation struck him like a physical blow. His neighbors, the families he served bread to every morning, the children who pressed their faces against his bakery window, all sleeping peacefully while death approached in the darkness. The warrior's words about soldiers planning to blame the Apache made a terrible kind of sense. Fitting with rumors Samuel had heard about land speculators wanting to expand mining operations into territories still claimed by various tribes. The tall warrior, who Samuel would later learn was called Taza, meaning strong one, continued speaking in his measured English. These soldiers wear different uniforms, carry different weapons. They are paid by men who want this land cleared of both Apache and settlers. They will leave signs that point to our people. But we have watched them from the ridges. They speak the language of greed, not the language of soldiers who serve their nation with honor. Nahana moved closer to Samuel, his young face serious beyond his years. In the mixture of languages they had developed, he explained that his family's band had been tracking this group of mercenaries for days, watching as they scouted the town and planned their attack. The Apache had initially intended simply to avoid the area, wanting no part in the white man's conflicts. But when Nahana had told them of the baker who fed him without asking for anything in return, the warriors had debated long into the previous night about what honor demanded of them. The second warrior, younger than Taza but bearing similar scars of experience, spoke rapidly in Apache. Taza nodded and translated. My brother Yellow Horse says we must move quickly. The false soldiers will attack when the moon sets, thinking to catch your people in the deepest sleep. That gives us perhaps 3 hours to prepare. Samuel felt the weight of impossible responsibility settling on his shoulders. How could he convince an entire town to abandon their homes based on a warning from Apache warriors? Most of his neighbors viewed any Apache with suspicion or outright hatred. They would likely assume this was itself some kind of trap, a ruse to get them to abandon their property so it could be looted, or to draw them into an ambush. But as Samuel looked into Nahana's eyes, seeing the genuine concern there, and observed the serious demeanor of the warriors who had risked exposure to bring this warning, he found himself believing completely in the truth of what he was being told. These men had nothing to gain from deception, and the child he had fed for weeks had never shown him anything but honest gratitude. Taza seemed to understand Samuel's dilemma without need for explanation. Your people will not trust words from Apache mouths, he said simply. But perhaps they will trust what their own eyes can see. Yellow Horse and Silent Wolf will guide you to where the false soldiers wait. You can witness their preparations for yourself. See the truth of what we tell you. Then you must decide how to save your people. The third warrior, Silent Wolf, stepped forward and gestured for Samuel to follow. Despite every instinct screaming warnings about venturing into the desert night with armed Apache, Samuel found himself nodding. If there was even a chance that what they told him was true, he had to see for himself. The lives of nearly 200 townspeople potentially hung in the balance. Silent Wolf moved through the darkness with supernatural quiet, leading Samuel up rocky slopes and through narrow passages that seemed invisible until they were directly underway. The warrior's knowledge of the terrain was absolute, every stone and shadow familiar territory. Samuel, despite years of frontier living, felt clumsy and loud by comparison. But Silent Wolf showed infinite patience, occasionally stopping to help Samuel navigate particularly difficult sections. After nearly an hour of careful climbing, Silent Wolf held up a warning hand and pointed ahead. They had reached a narrow ledge, overlooking a hidden canyon, about 2 miles from Cedar Ridge. Below them, Samuel could see the glow of a carefully shielded campfire and the shapes of men moving with military precision around what was clearly a temporary encampment. Samuel counted at least 15 figures, all armed with rifles and carrying equipment that looked more like raiding gear than standard military supplies. Their horses were picketed nearby, and even in the dim light, Samuel could see bundles of what looked like Apache arrows, pieces of distinctive tribal clothing, and other items that could be left behind to implicate the local tribes in whatever violence was planned. One of the men below was speaking in a voice that carried clearly in the still desert air, giving instructions about timing and positioning. Samuel heard enough to confirm everything the Apache had told him. The attack was planned for just before dawn, when the town's people would be deepest in sleep. The goal was to kill as many as possible and burn enough buildings to create the impression of a major Apache raid, justifying a military response that would clear the remaining tribes from valuable mining territory. Silent Wolf touched Samuel's arm and pointed to a different section of the canyon, where Samuel could see additional supplies and what appeared to be a wagon loaded with mining equipment hidden under canvas tarps. This was not the gear of desperate Apache raiders, but the carefully planned operation of men who intended to profit from the violence they were about to unleash. The return journey to town passed in a blur of desperate urgency. Samuel's mind raced through possibilities, each seeming more impossible than the last. Even if he could convince some people to listen, how could they organize any meaningful defense or evacuation in the few hours remaining? Cedar Ridge had no formal military presence, just a part-time sheriff and a handful of men with hunting rifles. When they reached the town's outskirts, Taza was waiting with Nahana and 2 additional Apache warriors Samuel had not seen before. The group had clearly been busy during Samuel's absence, scouting the town's perimeter and identifying the most likely approaches for the planned attack. Taza's assessment was grim. They will come from 3 directions, setting fires to drive people into the main street where they can be easily killed. Your sheriff's office and the saloon will be their first targets. To eliminate any organized resistance, they have planned well for this evil work. Samuel realized that conventional warnings and evacuation plans would be useless against such a coordinated assault. Even if he could somehow convince the townspeople to take the threat seriously, there was nowhere they could retreat to that would offer safety from mounted attackers with superior weapons and knowledge of the terrain. But as Samuel looked at the Apache warriors who had risked their own safety to bring warning of the approaching danger, a different kind of plan began to form in his mind. These men knew this land better than anyone. They had military experience fighting against overwhelming odds. Most importantly, they had chosen to involve themselves in protecting people who had shown them nothing but hostility. Speaking carefully, Samuel outlined what he was thinking. Instead of trying to evacuate the entire town, which would be impossible to organize in time, what if they could turn the attackers' own plan against them? The Apache could guide the townspeople to positions where they could defend themselves effectively, using their knowledge of local terrain to create advantages the attackers would not expect. Taza listened intently, occasionally conferring with his companions in rapid Apache. When Samuel finished speaking, the warrior was quiet for a long moment. Considering, finally, he nodded slowly. It is a dangerous plan, but it may be the only one that offers hope. We will need to convince your people to trust us with their lives. That may be the hardest battle of all. Samuel knew Taza was right. The plan would require every person in Cedar Ridge to place complete faith in the same Apache they had been taught to fear and distrust. It would mean abandoning their homes and businesses to follow warriors from a tribe many considered their enemies. The irony was overwhelming. The very people the town had rejected and vilified might now be their only hope for survival. As if reading his thoughts, Nahana stepped forward and placed a small hand on Samuel's arm. In the simple English he had been learning, the boy said, "You gave bread when I was hungry. Now we give life when you need it. This is how people should be to each other." Those words, spoken with such simple clarity by a child who had every reason to hate the people of Cedar Ridge, crystallized everything for Samuel. The artificial divisions between Apache and settler, the fear and prejudice that kept communities apart, all of it paled in comparison to the basic human bonds of kindness and mutual aid that connected all people. Samuel took a deep breath and nodded to Taza. "Tell me what we need to do. I'll find a way to make them listen." The next hour would test every relationship Samuel had built during his years in Cedar Ridge, every ounce of trust and respect he had earned through honest dealing and community service. Armed with the terrible knowledge of what was coming and the desperate hope that compassion could overcome prejudice, Samuel prepared to wake his neighbors and ask them to bet their lives on the word of Apache warriors and the promise of a hungry child who had been shown unexpected kindness. Samuel's first stop was the home of Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the town's physician and one of the few people he trusted to listen with an open mind. Elizabeth had arrived in Cedar Ridge 2 years earlier, bringing modern medical training and a refreshing lack of prejudice that had sometimes put her at odds with more traditional townspeople. Samuel had always admired her willingness to treat anyone who needed care, regardless of their ability to pay or their background. When Samuel's urgent knocking roused her from sleep, Elizabeth appeared at her door with the alertness of someone accustomed to medical emergencies. But as Samuel quickly explained the situation, her expression shifted from professional concern to incredulous disbelief. The idea that Apache warriors were warning them of an impending attack by disguised soldiers seemed like the product of nightmare or fever dream. However, Elizabeth was also a woman of science, who believed in evidence over assumption. When Samuel offered to show her the enemy encampment that Silent Wolf had revealed, she grabbed her medical bag and a warm coat, following him into the darkness with the same courage that had brought her to the frontier in the first place. The return journey to the canyon lookout was quicker this time, with Silent Wolf leading both Samuel and Elizabeth along paths that seemed to materialize from the rocky landscape. Elizabeth's medical training had given her a good grasp of human anatomy and movement, and she immediately recognized the professional military bearing of the men in the hidden camp below. More importantly, her physician's eye caught details Samuel had missed. The equipment and supplies visible in the camp were far too expensive and sophisticated for a ragtag group of Apache raiders. These men had backing, organization, and resources that spoke of wealthy interests rather than desperate survival. When she spotted what appeared to be surveying equipment among their supplies, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Elizabeth's conversion to belief was total and immediate. As they made their way back to town, she was already planning how to approach other influential townspeople. Her medical practice had given her insight into the relationships and personalities of nearly everyone in Cedar Ridge, knowledge that would prove invaluable in the desperate hours ahead. Their next stop was the home of James Sullivan, the town's blacksmith and unofficial leader of the Irish immigrants who made up a significant portion of Cedar Ridge's population. James had fled poverty and oppression in his homeland, and Elizabeth believed his personal experience with injustice might make him more receptive to the idea that Apache could be allies rather than enemies. James listened to their account with the careful attention of a man who had learned to weigh information before acting. His questions were practical and pointed. How many attackers? What weapons? What terrain advantages might be available? When Samuel described the coordination and equipment he had observed, James nodded grimly. I've seen work like this before. Back in Ireland, men with money and land fever, using violence to clear out people they see as obstacles to profit. With James convinced, they had the nucleus of a group that others might listen to. The blacksmith's reputation for level-headed thinking carried weight with many townspeople, and his willingness to consider the Apache warning would give others permission to do the same. Working through the pre-dawn darkness, the growing group of converts moved carefully through Cedar Ridge, waking trusted individuals and families. Each conversation was a delicate negotiation, requiring just the right approach for each personality. Some responded to appeals to Christian charity and the biblical injunction to love one's enemies. Others were convinced by the practical evidence of the conspiracy they faced. A few simply trusted Samuel's judgment, based on years of honest dealing. The most challenging conversation was with Sheriff Tom Morrison, Samuel's distant cousin, and a man whose skepticism about Apache intentions ran particularly deep. Tom had lost friends in conflicts with various tribal groups and found it almost impossible to believe that Apache warriors would risk themselves to save a white settlement. But Tom was also an experienced lawman who recognized the signs of a professional criminal operation when he heard them described. The equipment, timing, and false flag nature of the planned attack all fit patterns he had seen in other territories where land speculation drove violence. When Elizabeth added her medical authority to Samuel's account, and James supported them with his own hard-earned wisdom about organized oppression, Tom's resistance finally crumbled. With the sheriff's grudging cooperation, They had the legitimacy needed to organize a larger response. Tom's authority gave cover for the desperate plan taking shape, even as he privately wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his career. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, nearly the entire population of Cedar Ridge had been roused and gathered in the town's church, the largest building that could accommodate everyone. The scene was surreal. Families clutching hastily packed belongings, confused children rubbing sleep from their eyes, men checking weapons they hoped they would not need to use. Standing before this crowd of frightened, skeptical faces, Samuel felt the full weight of what he was asking them to do. These people were being told to trust their lives to strangers from a culture they had been taught to fear, based on a warning that seemed to come from the pages of some wild frontier tale. But as Samuel began to speak, explaining how his simple act of feeding a hungry child had led to this moment, something remarkable happened. The story seemed to resonate with the fundamental decency that existed beneath the layers of fear and prejudice. Parents looked at their own children and imagined them hungry and alone. People remembered their own moments of desperation, when strangers had shown unexpected kindness. When Taza and his warriors entered the church, the tension was palpable. Many hands moved instinctively toward weapons, and several people stepped back despite themselves. But Nahana accompanied the Apache men, and the sight of the boy Samuel had been feeding somehow made everything else feel less threatening. Taza spoke simply and directly, his accented English carrying absolute conviction. He outlined the defensive positions the Apache had identified, explained how the terrain could be used to their advantage, and detailed the timing that would be crucial for success. His military bearing and obvious competence gradually won over even some of the most skeptical listeners. The plan that emerged was elegant in its use of local knowledge. The Apache warriors would guide groups of townspeople to positions in the rocks above Cedar Ridge's main approaches. Hidden among the boulders and defensive positions that nature had carved from the landscape, the townspeople would have clear fields of fire while remaining largely invisible to attackers approaching from below. Meanwhile, a smaller group would remain in town to set fires and create the impression of normal activity, drawing the attackers into the trap. It was a strategy that turned the raiders' own plan against them, using their expectations of an easy target to create a devastating ambush. As the townspeople moved into position, guided by Apache warriors who knew every stone and shadow, Samuel found himself marveling at the transformation that had taken place. People who had never spoken to an Apache were now following them through dangerous terrain, trusting completely in their expertise and good faith. Children who had been taught to fear tribal peoples were now being carried to safety on the shoulders of warriors who treated them with gentle care. The attack came exactly as Taza had predicted. Just as the false dawn gave way to the first hints of true sunrise, the raiders approached Cedar Ridge with the confidence of men who believed they were about to slaughter sleeping victims. They rode hard toward the town's center, whooping and firing weapons to create the impression of an Apache raid, completely unaware that nearly 200 pairs of eyes were watching their approach from concealed positions. When Sheriff Tom gave the signal, the hidden defenders opened fire with devastating effect. The raiders, caught completely by surprise in the open ground they had expected to dominate, found themselves trapped in a crossfire that left them no escape routes and no cover. The battle was over in minutes, with most of the attacking force either killed or captured. The aftermath revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Among the raiders' possessions were found detailed maps of mining claims, correspondence with land speculators, and evidence of similar attacks planned for other settlements throughout the territory. The Apache warning had not only saved Cedar Ridge but had exposed a larger criminal enterprise that threatened communities across the region. In the days that followed, as the full story emerged and spread beyond Cedar Ridge, the transformation in relationships between the town and local Apache bands was remarkable. Taza's warriors were invited to establish a permanent camp near the settlement, with formal agreements for mutual aid and protection. Trade relationships developed, with Apache knowledge of the land and its resources proving valuable to the growing community. Nahana, the hungry child whose need had started this chain of events, became a bridge between the two communities. He learned English while teaching Apache language and customs to interested townspeople. His presence in Samuel's bakery, which had once been a secret, became a symbol of the cooperation that had replaced suspicion and fear. Samuel's bakery thrived as never before. But not just because of increased business. The daily bread he shared had become part of a larger story about how small acts of kindness could grow into bonds strong enough to save lives and transform entire communities. People came not just for food but to hear again the story of how feeding one child had led to saving a whole town. Years later, when historians and journalists came to document the events at Cedar Ridge, they struggled to separate legend from fact. The story seemed almost too neat, too perfectly symbolic of frontier cooperation, overcoming conflict. But the documentary evidence was overwhelming. Official reports, newspaper accounts, and the testimony of dozens of participants all confirmed the essential truth. Samuel Morrison, the simple baker whose compassion had sparked this chain of events, never saw himself as heroic. When asked about his role in the transformation of Cedar Ridge, he would simply point to Nahana, now grown to young manhood, and serving as a translator and guide for travelers throughout the territory. "I just gave bread to a hungry child," Samuel would say. "Everything else came from that boy's courage and his people's sense of honor." The story of Cedar Ridge became a touchstone throughout the American West, proof that cooperation between different peoples was not only possible, but could be the key to survival in a harsh and unforgiving land. The town grew and prospered, its success built on the foundation of trust that had been forged in one terrible night when enemies became allies and strangers became family. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was the simplest one. In bakeries throughout the territory, and eventually across the nation, it became common practice to set aside bread for hungry children, regardless of their background or circumstances. The custom was known as Samuel's Loaf, and it served as a daily reminder that the smallest acts of human kindness could have consequences beyond imagining. Nahana, grown old and respected as an elder in his own right, would tell his grandchildren that the most important lesson he had learned was not about the dramatic rescue or the transformation of a community. It was that one person's willingness to see past fear and prejudice to simple human need could change everything that followed. The bread that Samuel gave to one starving Apache child had indeed saved an entire town, but more than that, it had proven that compassion could overcome even the deepest divisions.